Right.
Okay.
So here is my first question. So tell us more about who you are.
Okay. So my name is Jim Brasseur, Professor James Brasseur. Most of my students call me Professor Brasseur. I got my degrees all in aerospace engineering, my bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, and my master's and PhD in aeronautical and astronautical sciences at Stanford University. I then did 3 postdoctoral associateships, one at NASA Ames Research Center doing computational fluid dynamics, one at the University of Southampton in England doing wind tunnel experiments and some analytical theory. And then my third one was at Johns Hopkins University, where I was doing mainly theoretical work and computational work in turbulence. The first area at NASA Ames was computational fluid dynamics of transonic flows. The second at Southampton was aerodynamics of high-speed vehicles, high-speed trains, magnetic levitated trains. And the third one was in fundamental turbulence research, which then became one of my main areas of research as I progressed into my academic career. So then I became a professor at Clemson University in South Carolina for 3 years, then at Pennsylvania State University, State College, Pennsylvania for 27 years. I retired in 2015, I think it was, and became a research professor at the University of Colorado, moved to Boulder from State College, moved to Boulder, Colorado from State College, Pennsylvania, and became a research professor, mainly gave up teaching and just continued doing research. And that's my situation today.
Mhm. So why did you want to major in aerospace engineering?
Well, to be perfectly honest, if I go all the way back to when I was considering which area in which to go, that would have been the late 60s, quite a long time ago from your perspective. I basically looked at all the courses that were being offered in the different departments. I knew I wanted to go into the sciences. I've always enjoyed science and mathematics. It's always been something that I've been good at and interested in. And frankly, just by reading the course catalog and finding out the courses and reading the description of the courses, for some reason, I was really intrigued by the course offerings in aerospace engineering. Unlike many people, like perhaps yourself, where you have specific interest in air flight, perhaps space flight, and so on. I really didn't. There was just something about the courses that interested me, and I knew I wanted to either be in engineering or physics. And I decided to go into engineering, and it interested me. It just sounded interesting to me. So that's sort of what kicked it off. Very soon after that, however, I became interested. As an undergraduate, of course, you're learning everything. But even as an undergraduate, when I think back, I was very interested in fluid dynamics. I didn't know much about it. Of course, I was taking courses like you all do, or you all will when you go to your undergraduate. And I was taking courses in fluid dynamics and just discovered that I really loved it and turned it into my career. So I really think of myself more as a fluid dynamicist than an aerospace engineer, although aerodynamics is fundamental to aerospace engineering. So I understand a lot, obviously, about aerospace engineering, but I've never worked in industry, so I don't have the industrial perspective for aerospace engineering. And I kind of think of what I do more broadly as crossing over between aerospace, mechanical, some chemical engineering. There's a lot of fluid dynamics and chemical engineering. And now I even work in the geophysical sciences, meteorology in particular. So I even cross over to the geosciences as well.
So you did mention that turbulence was one of your main topics of research, right?
I did. I have 2 main areas of research. They both actually began with my postdoctoral period at Johns Hopkins, because I was working with a very well-known researcher in turbulence, a man named Stan Corson. If anybody in turbulence would have heard the name Stan Corson, he passed away some years ago, but very well known. But he also had a side interest in biomechanics of the gastrointestinal tract. And that was only because there were medical researchers at the Johns Hopkins Medical School who had come to the College of Engineering and asked for some help from engineers because they were doing a lot of work that involved mechanical principles, and they themselves were not trained in mechanics. So they were asking for people to help them learn and understand better, and even perhaps collaborate with them. And I just happened to step into that at the time. So my main area of research was turbulence, but then I started getting interested in the physiology and biomechanics of the gastrointestinal tract. At that point, it was just basically a theoretical study, which got published in a journal. But then after I left and started my own career at the university as a professor, I started writing grant proposals in turbulence and in biomechanics of the gastrointestinal tract, and basically started two careers simultaneously. So those are my two main areas of research.
So about biomechanics, how does it? So with biomechanics, how do you? What is your main research in biomechanical engineering, like biomechanics? Like how does it relate to aerospace?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first, let me tell you a little bit about my work in biomechanics. I don't know, it doesn't really relate to aerospace that much. There is something that is related to it that does relate to aerospace. So I got involved, mainly it was because these people in the medical school that I was telling you about, their area of research was an area called dysphagia, which means swallowing disorders, people that have disorders in swallowing. Now, I'll just say, where does that come into fluid mechanics? Well, if you think about anything you eat or drink, like have a cup of coffee sitting here, it's obviously a fluid, it's a liquid, right? And air is a fluid. So, I mean, and liquids and gases are fluids. So then anything that involves liquids and gases. So as soon as you swallow, even if you're swallowing solids, you chew it and you mix it with saliva and it becomes a fluid at that point. So fluid mechanics is really kind of central to the whole function of the gastrointestinal tract, but it involves interactions with the muscles along the gastrointestinal tract. And it's that interaction that makes the problem interesting. And the neurological system comes in to control muscle contractions, which then control the mixing in the gastrointestinal tract and the transport, of your food through the esophagus into the stomach and the intestines and so on, into the colon and so on. All of that is fluid being driven by muscle contractions, being controlled by the neurological system in the human body. Okay, now there's a lot of mechanics in that. I hope it's obvious to anybody listening to me at this point that the interaction between muscles that are contracting onto fluids to move them and mix them and so on, that's very mechanics, right? And that's why they came to the College of Engineering, is they were dealing with things like pressure and force and stress and tension and all these things, but they really didn't understand very much about it. And they certainly didn't know how to apply engineering tools and mechanics and the principles of mechanics. They didn't really understand how to apply that. So they were asking for help. And I got very interested in it. And then I got involved in it. I got some NIH grants, and actually I've had a whole, 30, 40 year history of grants. And what does it have to do with aerospace? Well, I guess not directly, but now there's a lot of interest, of course, in space travel. And in the department I'm in right now, which is aerospace engineering sciences at the University of Colorado, there's a big emphasis on the space side of aerospace engineering, whereas in my previous history, it was more on the aero side of aerospace engineering. But here there's a lot of emphasis on space, and there's a whole group of professors and students in the department who work on issues relating to humans being in space for long periods of time. Like now they're actually talking seriously about missions to Mars, where an astronaut would be, it would be years before they got back, not weeks like it was to the moon, but it'll be years to get to Mars and come back. And so you have to be really concerned about how the human body is impacted by zero gravity for that long period of time, as well as all of the others, radiation issues, a lot of serious radiation issues. And some of these issues do impact the gastrointestinal tract, not so much the part that I deal with, but they're very concerned, for example, about radiation and how that could impact the way the gastrointestinal tract functions, as well as the human body in general. But since I do gastrointestinal research, there is a lot of concern with that. The part that I work on, which is sort of the mechanical process of moving material around within the gastrointestinal tract, there's not as much concern about that, but there is a lot of concern about how fluid redistributes itself in zero gravity, and how that redistribution of fluid in the human body could have negative impacts or certainly change the impacts. But obviously, nutrition is critical to these missions. You don't want the astronauts getting sick. You don't want them throwing up. That would be really, it's a bad thing on Earth, but if you can imagine throwing up in a space capsule, that's really a bad thing. And all those, anything, even things like defecating, going to the bathroom, involves the gastrointestinal tract. And it's, we don't think about that on Earth, but it doesn't take much thinking to realize that that's a big issue when you're on a spacecraft for a year at a time, or even in the space shuttle, and so on. So there, in fact, there is a lot of interest by NASA people. By NASA, there's grants that you can get to actually study the changes in the physiology associated with zero gravity and associated with radiation exposure that astronauts are exposed in outer space. And obviously, when you land on the planet, there's other issues that come in. So if you can't function physically, then the missions is going to fail, right? So it is important. And there's a whole group. There's one team, for example, who deals with the spacesuit. That's a big deal. And the spacesuit is all about keeping the physiological system working properly, right? And not being exposed to excessive radiation and so on. So there is definitely direct importance. However, it's much broader than that. So if you allow me to go beyond aerospace and talk about mechanical engineering or even chemical engineering, there's a whole area of discipline. It's not just biomechanics, but it's actually called biomedical engineering. It involves bones, it involves fluids, it involves muscle, it involves tissue, it involves healing of wounds. There's a lot of surgery. If you think about surgery, you're cutting the muscles with a knife. That's mechanics, right? And the muscles cannot contract like they did before. So there's a whole area of most colleges of engineering have a bioengineering or biomedical engineering department. And I was part of the biomedical engineering department at Penn State University when I was there. So it's broader, much broader than aerospace. Okay, so I'll leave it at that.
So through your research, what has been one of your major discoveries, if there has been any?
Well, okay, yes, I feel that there's been a number of major discoveries. I'd have to tell you a little bit more about the research that I do to describe what these are. There, as I was explaining to you in our email exchange, I'm a fundamental science researcher, a researcher that researches fundamental science, and it has applications. So, for example, in the gastrointestinal tract, I worked with gastroenterologists who were developing instrumentation to make measurements for people that had medical issues associated with the gastrointestinal tract. And I was involved in developing manometry systems that go into the human body and so on. One of my important discoveries, as it were, in the GI tract is, well, there's a couple, but the one that I'm talking about right now is in the esophagus. It turns out that the esophagus is the tube that goes between the oral cavity where you chew your food up, and the stomach down here. It's the tube that takes the food from there to there. And that it turns out that in humans, the muscle is of two types. The upper part of the esophagus is so-called striated muscle, and the lower 2/3 or so is so-called smooth muscle. And most of the gastrointestinal tract is smooth muscle. Well, it turns out that the transition between these two muscle types has an impact on the swallowing process, on the movement of the food, through the bolus. And we made some discoveries. I was working with a gastroenterologist at the University of Zurich, in Zurich, Switzerland. And he was making magnetic resonant imaging measurements together with manometry measurements of the esophagus. And We also worked on the stomach a lot together. His group and my group worked on the stomach a lot, and there was another major discovery on the stomach. But through that collaboration, we did modeling, and we did analytical analysis methods on his data to show that there's this transition between the upper and the lower part of the esophagus that has a big impact on how the food actually moves and why it gets hung up. It's been known for a long time that the food tends to get hung up there. And we pretty much solved the problem, the question why and how, and that then can lead to methods to try to deal with the problem. On the turbulence side, turbulence is much more complicated. Behind me, I'm going to move a little bit out of the way so that you can see. This is a tornado. A tornado. And it's very turbulent. I mean, this is one of the highest Reynolds number flows on Earth. And turbulence is associated with something called Reynolds number. It's something that if you go into fluid mechanics, you will learn. It's fundamental. You learn it almost right away when you go into fluid mechanics. And turbulence is extremely complicated. It has all of these eddying motions that you can see behind me, and they're all interacting with each other and so on. We made some important discoveries on how the largest scale motions impact the smallest scale motions, and how the smallest scale motions actually do not impact the largest scale motions. But that was the fundamental question, is how they do. It turns out that these interactions between large and small scale are very fundamental to a number of important technologies, in particular combustion. I'm working a lot in combustion these days, and the interaction between the large eddy motions in combustion. So in your internal combustion engine in your car, there's a lot of turbulence that's generated by the combustion process, and that turbulence interacts with the chemistry. That's why a lot of chemical engineers do fluid mechanics as well, as the turbulence interacts with the chemistry and makes it an even more complicated problem. But we were able to show through our fundamental work that the large motions can directly change the small motions where most of the combustion takes place. But the small motions cannot directly alter the large motion. So it's kind of a one-way forcing. So those are two of our discoveries, and they're obviously fundamental science kind of discoveries with impacts in technology.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that like majoring in aerospace engineering and everything. So how would high school students like me would get prepared for to major in aerospace engineering? To not aerospace engineering, but like in engineering in general.
You mean as a high school student?
Yeah, how should we prepare?
Well, obviously, you be prepared by taking science courses, physics courses especially, and mathematics courses, in particular calculus. You should, before you leave high school, you should try to get as much calculus as you can, both differential calculus and integral calculus, and you should take physics courses. And I don't know, in today's high school, maybe you have more broader courses than you did when I was in high school. When I was in high school, it was physics, chemistry, and mathematics. And mathematics, for those of us who were especially good at math and particularly wanted to pursue it, they offered calculus courses. And the fact I took every calculus course I could get my hands on, which was a great help when I went to the university. So yeah, if you're an engineer, like in any profession has its language, shall we say. You have to use certain tools. And in engineering, there are a number of them, but all of them are based on calculus. So you have to love calculus. You have to want to learn it, but you also have to enjoy it. You know, if you're the kind of a person who says, I don't like math, I think you should consider a different area than engineering. So I just summarize. Physics, chemistry is not bad. You might go into chemical engineering, in which case chemistry, and calculus.
Mm-hmm. So, what is something that you regret not doing in your major? So what do you regret not doing since the beginning? Like when you look back, what do you go and say, I wish I had done that before?
I can't really think of anything in my case.
Mhm.
I mean, they're like anybody in a career, you always think back and there's always these choices that you have. Your career goes along this way, and then at some point you're presented an opportunity and you might go this way instead of this way. And we all look back and say, well, what if I had chosen to go this way instead of that way? But that's not what you're asking, I don't think. So I guess I can't really think of anything. I think I did the right things from the beginning. I emphasized science and math from the beginning. And when I went into the university, I applied that, and I worked very hard. I guess, no, I have no regrets. I guess I'm kind of going back to your previous question. You also have to be somebody who is not only excited about their profession, but is willing to work hard and really learn, take advantage of other people's knowledge and bring yourself up. But I don't have any personal things that I would have done differently that I can think about.
Mhm.
I guess I'll mention something that people in your position will think about. I always knew, frankly, from the time even as a high school student, I knew I loved basic science as opposed to kind of working in an industry and working nuts and bolts. We need people of all kinds. We need people who are really good. I call them nuts and bolts engineer, the people who can make things and make them work and make them work well. We need that. We also need the fundamental scientists like myself. And we need everybody in between. Okay. There's a big, broad spectrum. And I always knew from the beginning that I was interested in fundamental science. And when I went to the university, I knew that from the beginning. And it wasn't long before I realized that I wanted to be a professor. So in my case, it was really straightforward. I didn't have any major issues deciding what I wanted to do. I
Mhm.
kind of knew, you know.
Well, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview you today. And I
Yeah.
I hope people watching this is going to learn something new. And yeah.
Yeah. Would you mind, I suggested in my email